pretend there is not a problem, nor is it a moment to allow the fear of failure to hold us back. This is a time to show the leadership that our people are quite rightly demanding. Tinkering here and there and hoping we'll drift to a solution simply isn't going to cut it anymore. This is a time for boldness, not for caution. Boldness in what we do nationally, but boldness also in what we do together as a continent. Now, in Britain, we have had to be bold. We were faced, as we came into government, with the biggest budget deficit in our peacetime history, more than 10% of our GDP. We had the most leveraged banks, the most indebted households, and the biggest housing boom. To be cautious would have been catastrophic. Instead, we were bold and decisive. We formed the first coalition government for 70 years. We legislated for a fixed-term, 5-year parliament, which has helped to give people the confidence of stability and credibility. We put forward an aggressive set of plans to get our economy back on an even keel. £5.5 billion saved inside the first financial year, the one that was already underway. Welfare bills, cut. The cost of government, cut. Public sector pay, frozen. The state pension age, increased. Let me give you one example, the reform of public sector pensions. This is a difficult issue for any government. We want public servants to have good pensions. We've ensured that that is the case, but at the same time, we've actually cut the long-term cost in half. By taking bold decisions to get to grips with the debt, Britain has shown that it is possible to earn credibility and get ahead of the markets. Our borrowing costs have fallen to the lowest for a generation, and we will be equally bold in meeting our key ambition, which is to support enterprise and to make Britain the best place in the world in which to start or to grow a business. So we are pursuing an unashamedly pro-business agenda, scrapping needless red tape, simplifying planning, reviewing all regulation, creating the most competitive business tax regime in the developed world, with corporation tax coming down to 23%. We're making bold investments in new infrastructure, including high-speed rail. And while we may be fiscal conservatives, we are monetary radicals. We are injecting cash into the banking system and introducing credit easing measures to make it easier for small businesses to access finance. So my message to you in this special Olympic year for Britain is that we are a country that is absolutely committed to enterprise and to openness. Come to Britain, invest in Britain, be part of this special year in a truly great country. So yes, in Britain, we're taking the bold steps necessary to get our economy back on track. But my argument today is that the need for bold action at the European level is equally great. Europe's lack of competitiveness is its Achilles heel. For all the talk, the Lisbon strategy has failed to deliver the structural reforms that we need. The statistics are pretty staggering. As measured by the World Economic Forum, more than half of EU member states are now less competitive than they were this time last year, while 5 EU member states are now less competitive than a country that is pretty sclerotic, Iran. For every euro invested in venture capital in the EU, 5 times as much is being invested in the US. Our single market, one of our greatest strengths, remains incomplete, and there are still a colossal 4,700 professions across the European Union to which access is regulated by government. And that is not all. In spite of the economic challenge, in spite of the unemployment challenge, we are still doing things through the EU to make life even harder. In the name of social protection, the EU has promoted unnecessary measures that impose burdens on businesses and governments and can destroy jobs. The Agency Workers Directive, the Pregnant Workers Directive, the Working Time Directive, the list goes on. And then, of course, there is the proposal for a financial transactions tax. Now, of course, it is right that the financial sector should pay their share. And in the United Kingdom, we're making sure that's the case with a bank levy and with the fact that we charge stamp duty on shares. And these are options that other countries can adopt. But if you look at the European Commission's own original analysis, that showed that a financial transactions tax could cost the GDP of the European Union and could reduce it by 200 billion euros. It could cost almost 500,000 jobs and force as much as 90% of some markets away from the European Union. Even to be considering this at a time when we're struggling to get our economies growing is quite simply madness. We shouldn't go on like this. That is why Britain has been arguing for a pro-business agenda in Europe. And this is not just a British agenda. Over the last year, we have spearheaded work with 15 other member states across the EU, both inside and outside the Eurozone. This weekend, Chancellor Merkel and I called for a package of deregulation and liberalisation policies. And our ideas now lie at the heart of what the European Commission is promoting too. Together, we're pushing for the completion of the single market in services and in digital. Those two things could add alone 800 billion euros to EU GDP. And they could lead the drive to exempt micro-businesses from excessive regulation, both new and existing. But I believe we need to be bolder still. So here is the checklist. All proposed EU measures should be tested for their impact on growth. We need a target to reduce the overall burden of EU regulation. And we need a new proportionality test to prevent needless barriers to trade in services and to slash the number of regulated professions in Europe. Now, together with our international partners, we also need to take decisive action to get trade moving. Now, I'm not going to give you the standard speech on Doha. Last year, at this very forum, world leaders called for an all-out effort to conclude the Doha round in 2011. We said it was make or break year. It was. And we have to be frank about it. It didn't work. But we must not give up on free trade. Let us step forward with a new and ambitious set of ideas to take trade forwards. First, rather than trying to involve everyone at once, let us get some bilateral deals done. Let's get the EU trade agreements with India, with Canada, with Singapore finalised by the end of this year. Completing all the deals now on the table could add 90 billion euros to Europe's GDP. And let's also look at all the options on the table for agreement between the EU and the US, where a deal could have a bigger impact than all the other agreements put together. Next, let's be more creative in the way we use the multilateral system. Far from turning our back on multilateralism, we need the continued work of the WTO to prevent any collapse back to protectionism, to ensure we take account of the interests of the poorest countries in our world, and to ensure that the WTO framework is fit for the 21st century. And I also believe it means going forwards, perhaps with a coalition of the willing, so countries who want to can forge ahead with more ambitious trade deals of their own, consistent within the WTO framework. Now, there are some proposals out there already, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but why not also an ambitious deal between Europe and Africa, or even a pan-African free trade area? This is a bold agenda on trade which can deliver tangible results for the world economy this year, and I'm proposing that we start work on it immediately. Now, of course, the most urgent question facing all of Europe right now is how to deal with the Eurozone crisis. And this is where I believe Europe needs to be boldest of all. Vital progress has been made. The European Central Bank has provided extensive additional support to Europe's banks. Many Eurozone countries are taking painful and difficult steps to address their deficits and to give up a degree of sovereignty over the governance of their economies in the future. And of course, there was the agreement to set up the firewall. Now, all of these are welcome and necessary steps. And I don't underestimate for one moment the leadership and the courage that has got us this far. But we need to be honest about the overall situation. The crisis is still weighing down on business confidence and weighing down on investment. A year ago, bond rates were 5% in Spain, nearly 5% in Italy, and more than 7% in Portugal. Today, they are still 5% in Spain, up to 6% in Italy, and 14% in Portugal. So we still need those urgent short-term measures to be properly put into effect. The October agreement needs to be fully implemented. The uncertainty in Greece has to be brought to an end. Europe's banks must be properly recapitalised. And as the IMF has said, the European firewall needs to be big enough to deal with the full scale of the crisis and the potential contagion. And Chancellor Merkel is absolutely right to insist that Eurozone countries must do everything possible to get to grips with their own debts. But we also need to be honest about the long-term consequences of a single currency. Now, I'm not one of those people who think that single currencies can never work. Look at America. Look at the United Kingdom. But there are a number of features that are common to all successful currency unions. A central bank that can comprehensively stand behind the currency and the financial system. The deepest possible economic integration with the flexibility to deal with economic shocks. And a system of fiscal transfers and collective debt issuance that can deal with the tensions and the imbalances between different countries and regions within the Union. Currently, it's not that the Eurozone doesn't have all of these, it's that it doesn't really have any of these. Now, clearly, if countries are close enough in their economic structure, then tensions are less likely to arise. But when imbalances are sustained, and some countries do better than others year after year, you can face real problems. That is what the current crisis is demonstrating. Now, of course, private capital flows can hide these problems for a while. In the Eurozone, that is what happened. But once markets lose confidence and dry up, you are left in an unsustainable position. Yes, tough fiscal discipline is essential, but this is a problem of trade deficits, not just budget deficits. And it means countries with those deficits making painful decisions to raise productivity, to drive down costs year after year to regain their competitiveness. But that doesn't happen overnight, and it can have painful economic and even political consequences. Nor, in fact, is it sufficient. You still need the support of single currency partners, and as Christine Lagarde has set out, a system of fiscal integration and risk sharing, perhaps through the creation of euro area bonds, to make that support work. As Mario Monti has suggested, the flip side of austerity in the deficit countries must be action to put the weight of the surplus countries behind the euro. Now, I'm not pretending that any of this is easy. These are radical, difficult steps for any country to take. Knowing how necessary, but also how hard they are, is why Britain didn't join the Eurozone. But they are what is needed if the single currency, as currently constituted, is to work. Now, of course, some people will say, it's all very well Britain making these points, but you're not in the euro, and in fact, last month, you even vetoed adding a new treaty to the European Union. Let me answer that very directly. I understand why the Eurozone members want a treaty inside the European Union. But if they do, there have to be safeguards for those countries that are in the European Union but who have no intention of joining the single currency. I didn't get those safeguards, so the treaty isn't going ahead inside the European Union. But let me be clear, to those who think that not signing the treaty means somehow Britain is walking away from Europe, let me tell you, nothing could be further from the truth. Britain is part of the European Union, not by default, but by choice. It fundamentally reflects our national interest to be part of the single market which is on our doorstep, and we have no intention of walking away from it. So let me be clear. We want Europe to be a success, and all the measures that we'll be proposing for next week's European Council can help achieve that success. But we want Europe to succeed not just as an economic force, but also as a political force, as an association of countries with the political will, the values, and the voice to make a difference in the world. When that political will is there, we can make a decisive difference. Together with President Sarkozy, Britain led the new European sanctions on Iran's oil exports, so the world doesn't have to confront a nuclear-armed Iran or a wider military conflict. In Syria, we've taken the lead against Assad's repressive violence, and we will not let up until he steps aside. And of course, in Libya, we secured that UN resolution and put together a multinational coalition faster than almost any time in our history. British and French pilots led the way together in the early hours when the fate of Benghazi was at stake. And together, we saw it through, helping the Libyan people overcome tyranny